Hey, everybody. Wow. Okay, is the mic hot? Welcome, y'all. I love trying to get a room quiet that's enjoying visiting with each other. So we're thrilled that we had to open the balcony. So a few of you in the back, if you can't find seats, please make your way. I guess, are there two sets of stairs, just one? I'm going to give just a minute for a few folks that are headed to the balcony to get there. So thrilled that y'all are here. So thrilled it's an overflow night. This is a night that many of us have been thinking about, praying about, hoping for a long time. I'm John Featherston, and I've tried to think about, as I prepared for tonight, a little bit I began to think about stereotypes. And so for me, stereotypes are when I think I'm doing my laziest thinking. So I want to begin the evening by highlighting to you that I am an OWG. Yeah, so some of y'all, you can process that. Obviously, I'm an old white guy. So my objective is for that to only be true of me demographically. So I thought about, if somebody said, there's this really interesting guy I want you to meet, he's a Christian guy from Georgia, and he's old, he's really interesting. And get this, he works for Chick-fil-A, so boy, I'm super exotic. But tonight, what we are is we're joining together as a fellowship of people who've decided that we want to be thinking people. And in deciding to be good stewards of our minds, we've decided we want to think about things that matter, we want to think about truth, and we want to do it in community. So you're hosted tonight by a group of local folks who decided to partner with this amazing organization called the Trinity Forum and invite them to come to Atlanta and help us to learn from what they've done in other cities, DC and New York, to convene people, bring them together, and talk about things that matter. So for us, we want to have dialogue about life's big questions. We want to talk about character and civility and pluralism. We want to have new ways of thinking. So this is our third event that we've sponsored. It's our second year for the Trinity Forum in Atlanta. Last year we had David Brooks and Robert Franklin talk with us on the topic of character, John Anazu and Ibu Patel on the topic of pluralism, and tonight Lecrae Moore and Michael Ware on the topic of civility. You know, when you think about civility, I think it's too easy to dumb it down to privileged people speaking nicely. Boy, that stinks. I'm not interested. I don't know about y'all. Civility, we think, is more than politeness. It's consideration of the perspective of others beyond my own perspective and to push myself to a different perspective. It's a different way to think about loving my neighbor. So tonight, what you are experiencing is a local gathering with a connectedness to a national movement that we want to be talking to each other about things that matter. And the two people that we're going to hear from tonight, Michael and Lecrae, are folks who at some level get to spend their time thinking and creating professionally. So we're the recipient and the beneficiaries of their giftedness. Often I find that thinking possibly has become a lost art or a lost activity or just lost. So welcome yourself into the possibilities of joining Lecrae and Michael into thinking about things that matter. And then let's not just have a passive response. Let's engage with what we hear. Let's do it with our own minds as we sit quietly listening. But let's do it with people we care about. Let's build new friendships. And so I want you to think about with me as I close and bring Cherie up. For me, I've thought about 3 C's in my life. Contemplation, cultivation, and compounding. Contemplation, I try to think about where I am. So I don't know where you are, but I recognized at one point in time I was in a mindset of confirmation instead of discovery. I've decided to change that. I have a mindset of discovery now, and I'm looking to be open to what is being revealed, to look for it and to see it. Cultivation, if you think about what you'd like to get out of the garden, you have to think about what you plant. So for me, I'm trying to cultivate intentionality to appreciate other people's perspective. I specifically am not a person of color or a gender or female, so I have to actively cultivate appreciating other people's perspective. And then lastly, the concept of compounding. I think about what would I like to be a little bit more like each day. So if you think about, compounding of interest on a savings account, even though it's little now, a little bit compounded over time, and you have something. Well, I began to think about, what if I was compounding bitterness, and I got just a little bit more bitter over time? Or what if I was compounding being filled with grace a little bit more over time, and how that might compound? So, as I close, I would share with you that I think it's my choice that the outcome of my life is that I'm either, I mentioned to you earlier, I'm an OWG currently. If the Lord blesses me with more days, will I either be a VOWG or a VWOG? I don't want to be a VWOG. I want to live my days with fullness, see what God has in store. Our host tonight really is Cherie Harder. Cherie will come to the stage. You will be amazed by her finesse, her grace, her easiness of spirit as she moves in and out of topics that matter. She's the perfect host for this event. So let's welcome Cherie Harder.
Well, John, thank you for that incredibly gracious introduction. As I was making my way up here, my chairman said, "Don't trip," after that. So, as John mentioned, this is the third event of the Character, Civility, and Pluralism initiative that we have launched in coordination with the Atlanta Steering Group. And it's been a very ambitious initiative that we've launched, and we're so glad that you've been able to join us tonight. Our hope in this is at a time when our public discourse and leadership on a national level has become increasingly overheated, dumbed down, and divisive, that these gatherings will provide a place for conversation around the first principles of civic life, the nature and necessity of character, civility, and pluralism, and what they mean for us individually, for our communities, and our country. At the very outset, I'd like to acknowledge the members of our Atlanta Steering Committee who have done so much, both through their work and their generosity, to make tonight possible. Our lead steering committee member, David Allman, is here, along with his wife, Nana, Jack Alexander, Jim and Julie Balloon, Chris Batchelder, John and Jackie Coleman, Mark DeMoss, Susanna Dryman, John and Jan Featherston, John and Susan Hamilton, Price and Nancy Harding, and I'll note that Price Harding is also the chairman of our board, David and Jenny Knight, Jenny Pruitt, our trustee Matt Teague, and Scotland and Peggy Wright. If you are a member of the steering committee, could you just raise your hand so people can recognize you and talk to you later? Thank you for that. I'd also like to acknowledge just a few special guests in the audience. We've had a few trustees come in from out of town, George Clark and Brian Johnson. We're really glad that you're here. But we're particularly delighted that each and every one of you are here tonight. As you can tell, we have a full house, and we know there are many people who wanted to be here tonight but could not. So if you have friends who wanted to be here and were prevented from one reason or the other, fear not. We are actually live streaming tonight's event. You can let them know, tweet at them, text them, let them know that they can log on. We'll also be recording the event tonight, and it'll be on our website and our YouTube channel. Our website is www.ttf.org, and we'll also be posting pictures on Facebook so you can tag your friends. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for the discussion of life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do this by providing readings and publications which draw upon classic works of literature that explore enduring questions and connect the timeless wisdom of the humanities to timely issues of the day, as well as by sponsoring events such as this program tonight to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders in engaging those big questions of life and ultimately coming to know the author of the answers. And certainly, one of those great questions, which seems particularly acute and urgent in our increasingly polarized, fractured, and alienated time, is how we live out our deepest convictions and live together as neighbors, friends, and fellow citizens in the midst of difference and division. By some measures, our country is the most polarized it has been since the Civil War. We see this in televised exchanges which devolve into shouting matches, the air of menace that hovers over many political gatherings, the clashes between law enforcement and minority communities, the decline of support for freedom of speech and religious liberty, the success of Twitter trolls in silencing, shaming, and scaring their targets, and in the manner in which disagreements are so often weaponized to demean and marginalize one's opponent. Ironically, even as we go increasingly ready to denounce those with whom we disagree, we are less likely to actually encounter and talk with them. Even as Americans are rapidly becoming more religiously, ideologically, racially, and ethnically diverse, we have also become increasingly segmented along financial, educational, ideological, and social lines. It grows ever easier to confine our socializing, our conversations, even our news feeds, to those with whom we agree, who mirror our preferences and confirm our viewpoints. Meanwhile, even though by some measures up to 95% of the electorate believe that public incivility is a dire problem, we, the people, collectively continue to gravitate towards the extreme, the divisive, even the nasty. Generating fear and loathing is often the quickest way to be heard, build a platform, signal one's philosophical purity, get likes, raise funds, or mobilize votes. But if fear and loathing build personal platforms, they also destroy the bridges necessary to cross divides. So at a time when so much of our public conversation is marked by animosity and anxiety, how do we address difference with courage and conviction? How do we live out our deepest differences while living with others with whom we disagree? These are difficult questions, and there are no easy answers. But our speakers tonight have wrestled with these questions on both a national and local and a personal and political level. A rapper and a writer, they are both keenly aware of the power of words to create or to destroy. They have both, from very different vantage points and within different industries, modeled courage of conviction and civility in expression, as well as weathered opposition as a result. And they have both reached across divides to speak difficult truths and to attempt the difficult but necessary work of persuasion. So it is a particular honor and pleasure to introduce our speakers this evening. Our first speaker, Lecrae, is a two-time Grammy Award-winning hip-hop artist whose recent album, Anomaly, debuted at #1 on the Billboard Top 200 rap, digital, Christian, gospel, and independent charts. His albums and mixtapes have sold nearly 2 million copies. He's been nominated for 5 Grammy Awards, including Best Rap Performance in 2014, a Grammy win for Best Gospel Album in 2013, and a Best Contemporary Christian Music Performance in 2015 as well. He's also won 7 Dove Awards, a Billboard Music Award, 2 Soul Train Music Awards, and garnered BET Hip Hop Awards and nominations. He recently released his 8th studio album entitled All Things Work Together and is the author of the New York Times bestselling work, Unashamed. We'll also hear from Michael Ware. Michael came to DC as a 21-year-old campaign staffer to help lead the faith-based outreach effort for newly elected President Barack Obama and became one of the youngest White House staffers in modern American history. He served as the Deputy Director of the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, where he led outreach efforts and helped manage the White House engagement on religious, social, and values issues. Since leaving the White House, Michael founded Public Square Strategies, a firm that helps religious, political, and business organizations navigate the changing American religious and political landscape. And in his free time, he writes frequently for The Atlantic, Christianity Today, USA Today, Relevant Magazine, and many other publications on faith, politics, and culture. He's also the author of Reclaiming Hope, Lessons Learned in the Obama White House about the Future of Faith in America. Immediately after Lecrae's opening remarks, we'll hear from Michael, and then both speakers and I they'll join me up here for a moderated conversation, followed by questions from the audience. Lecrae, welcome.
don't know what to do with this. This, I know what to do with. I would do a song, but that's too easy. It's better to hear the rapper wax philosophic and political and hear the politician and writer sing. Y'all know Michael can sing. So he's not gonna get away without singing for y'all. I just want you to know that. You should know that ahead of time. This looks just like one of my concerts. All right, I'm gonna stop joking. I'm gonna hurt my back today like this, but civility, right? I want to talk about civility, but through real life experience. And if I'm 100% honest, it's slightly intimidating because of the amount of incivility that I've experienced and having to rehash it. Even as I was going through some of the things that I've experienced over the last few years, it was a little jarring. I thank God for counseling. It's good. But what we tend to do is we tend to replace civility with tolerance in a lot of areas. We tolerate people versus actually engaging them civilly. We tolerate the lack of a unique morality pertaining to particular issues, and I will get into some of those particulars. Civility is us elevating self-expression over self-control. It's us not considering the needs of the interests of the public. This incivility. We need to rein in our impulses to speak hurtful words for the sake of everybody else who's journeying with us, right? Civility requires that we ask questions at the risk of looking ignorant, right? Process and question the things that we've always believed to be culturally acceptable, right? Civility is us realizing there is life and death in the power of the tongue, or the power of the type. And so, in my experience, a lot of the incivility that I've have had to navigate through, some of it has come in personal shape and form, but I think you all are aware of the stuff that's been more public. Incivility is not new to me, so it's not like this new thing where I'm like, oh man, that's crazy. I can't believe all the things I've had to deal with. It's not Black History Month for me. It's Black History every month for me. So I deal with it on a consistent basis as being a Black man, as being a minority, as being a rapper, as being a Christian. There's all kinds of ways where I experience it. And you know, as we think about how the internet has come into play and how the age of information and technology has increased the opportunity for people to act with a lack of civility. There's a disinhibition now because you are afforded anonymity. Nobody knows who you are if you're on social media. They never have to see you in person. You never have to engage that person in real life. So you feel a sense of arrogance, a sense of ability to say what you want to say. It's kind of like when I was 12 and I used to prank call people. It's like I felt like I could get away with anything because they're never going to catch me. They don't even know who this is. It allows you to reinvent yourself, right? You can create a caricature of yourself online and say things that you would never say to someone's face. You begin a passive habit of baiting people into intense conversations that really do unnerve and damage people's psyche, character, and so on and so forth. And the reality is, though you're able to make these, what could seem to be small little jabs at people online, it's doing real long-term damage to them in real life. And so, if you don't know anything about me, I am a rap artist. I have been afforded the opportunity to create, music and have it travel the world. When I started off doing music, I was doing it for my own community. I was doing it for those who like rap music and wanted to hear about God's truth in it. And in that process, the broader evangelical community, white evangelical community, said, wow, this kid is using words that we recognize and appreciate. This sounds seminarian to a degree. Did you go to school for this? And how are you able to talk about these complex theological issues in rap songs? And so I began to navigate spaces outside of the urban community, the community that gravitated to hip hop music. And I did so for quite a while. You know, I started doing this professionally 15 years ago now. And so in that time period, personally, I experienced a lot of things privately, right? You know, I experienced things that probably most of the minority community or people of color would find commonplace. And I never felt the need to discuss them amongst my white brothers and sisters because it was kind of like, well, this is just commonplace for me. I'm sure you don't know what it feels like. But I can remember a couple of occasions. One occasion specifically was me driving to a Christian sports camp, Kanakuk camps. And I was driving from Texas to Branson, Missouri. And as I got to around the Oklahoma area, I saw flashing lights behind me, and the lights pulled me over. And I asked, you know, is there a problem? And the officer exclaimed that my bumper, this is true, looks suspicious. It's true. My bumper looks suspicious. And so I said, oh, okay, I'm not sure what you mean. And what was explained to me was that, well, sometimes this is how people traffic drugs, is through bumpers that look like they may be being able to be removed. And so that's what it looked like to him. And from there, the officer said, you know, I told him, well, clearly I'm not a drug dealer. I'm a Christian rapper. I'm going to go rap for Jesus. But he said to me, you know, well, I'm going to get my dog, and we're going to walk around your car, and if he alerts, then we're going to check your car. And I said, oh, well, sure, feel free. You know, I have nothing to worry about. I'm a Christian rapper. So he gets the dog. The dog walks around the car, and I didn't notice the dog alerting, but according to the officer, the dog alerted. And so I was then asked to sit on the curb as they stripped the car. They took all the seats out of the car. They pulled everything out of the car and put it on the side of the road. And when they found nothing, they said, we didn't find anything, you're free to go. But free to go meant I was also free to put everything that had been taken out of the car back into the car and drive to do my concert in Branson, Missouri. That was not a new experience for my peer group. For the minority community, for people of color, it was a very regular type of experience that we could all share. And so I never felt the need to articulate those particular things, you know, to talk about them, specifically not in the music. It just wasn't the time and the place. And I did come to grasp the idea and the concepts that is pretty prevalent in evangelicalism, that if it interferes with evangelism or discipleship, it's a distraction. And so, well, clearly this was an interference of evangelism and discipleship, so I just need to keep it to myself and not discuss it. And that's kind of how I lived my life until 2012. In 2012, Trayvon Martin was murdered. And for a lot of people of color, specifically black people, this was to us an opportunity for what we see happening so consistent in our communities highlighted on a national stage. And I think there was a little bit of hope, right? There was this hope that, yes, now people will see what's been going on and something will come of this. And it didn't happen, right? What the black community thought would happen didn't happen. Well, I didn't know, I was unaware that there was this polarizing view on Trayvon. I knew plenty Trayvon, so I was like, oh, I know exactly what happened. clearly everyone will see now and justice will prevail. I didn't realize there was an alternative view that, well, this guy's a thug and he got what he deserved. And so unknowingly, I posted about it. And I said, this is heartbreaking. And I brought some of the comments from that post. Now, I thought I was being civil by saying, this is heartbreaking. I'm just tired every time a black person gets assaulted, the race card goes up when 90% of homicides are black on black. Maybe it's not racial, it's just violence. If Trayvon was my cousin, and I said this is heartbreaking, that would be the most incivil response someone could ever write me. But to me, Trayvon did feel like a cousin. It felt like part of my community, and so that was particularly painful. 2012 went by, and I chalked up the comments like that as, wow, man, maybe, I don't know. I was still a little shell-shocked, so maybe I'm just not seeing things correctly. I don't know. 2014 comes along, and without, going through each individual circumstance, there was Michael Brown, there was Eric Garner, there was Tamir Rice, all murdered, and different circumstances surrounding each one. But to many people, I realized these felt like individual instances. But for others, these were just a narrative, a continual narrative that we've seen played out year after year after year. And it broke my heart. Now, whether you agreed with me or you didn't agree with me about the circumstances of the case, the loss of these lives broke my heart. Because these could have easily been my family members. Maybe they were. And for one of them, Eric Garner specifically, I posted this, and I said, a family has lost a father, and parents have lost a son. I thought I was being pretty civil with that post. Here's some of the responses. Lecrae, I can weep for a family who's lost a father or parents who've lost a son, but I can't weep for criminals who are resisting arrest. I'm not a racist, but I want to point out that if he was white, no one would care. It's one of my favorites. You're supposed to be Christian, and then anything else afterwards. You're not trying to unify, you're participating in a divide. You need some self-inventory. I will never be buying your albums again. I used to rave about you, not anymore. Trip Lee is leaps and bounds ahead of you in spiritual maturity. Some of my favorites. So my point was not to bring up divisive topics. My point was to articulate that I was literally grieved to the point of needing counseling, grieved to seeing a reality that I knew all too well, grieved to seeing something that I've experienced in my family, in my own backyard that was very consistent. And the response, and these are some of the nicer ones, by the way, the responses were literally heart-wrenching. This is a pretty consistent response that I experienced from who I thought were my brothers and sisters in Christ. So it was jarring. And what I had to do is I had to sit back and think through, man, we are very Christian by name, but are we Christian by lifestyle? Civility is really a moral calling. And I believe the highest moral calling is that of a creator God. And so if we call ourselves believers, then civility is apropos. It's the standard. Luke 10:25-37 is the parable of the Good Samaritan, but it's often grasped differently because people have different worldviews. And most times we see things from our perspective and not God's perspective. And so basically the way you view the world is how you're going to respond to it. And if your worldview is not couched in God's understanding of what civility looks like, then is it are you functioning in a true picture of what God would have you function in? It just as an example, when I say take care of your family, most of us in America would think nuclear, mom, dad, kids. But if I take it to an Eastern culture, China perhaps, you don't think about a nuclear family. You think about everybody, grandma, cousins, auntie, take care of your family. And that's how worldviews work. Worldviews may not be your behavior, but usually your behavior is conditioned to your worldview. And so some people think all Christians have a single worldview, but they don't realize how deeply cultural we are and how culture's ingrained us with values and assumptions. Some are in line with God's word and some are not. They're just traditional. They're just cultural. Most times the assumptions are not reasoned out, they're just assumed to be true. And not all, but most of our problems occur when people from different societies mix different worldviews, and the differences are difficult to deal with, right? When the ecosystems come into conflict with one another, somebody's got to be right, right? And so, you know, I hope that our worldviews and our cultural biases are transformed by God's ultimate standard. And before I step aside, I really am excited about engaging in Q&A. I just want to read the parable of the Good Samaritan. Behold, a lawyer stood up and was put to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What's written in the law? How do you read it?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "Well, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" And Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. He fell amongst robbers who stripped him, beat him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by the other side, so likewise a Levite. And he came to the place and saw him and passed on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion." We know how the rest of the story goes. Out of his compassion, he went to him, he bound up his wounds, he poured on oil and wine, he gave all the money he had to put him up in an inn. And Jesus said, "Do this and you'll live." He's saying this relationship with God is what's going to give you life. So when we ask who's our neighbor, that assumes that we believe there's a non-neighbor. Who's my neighbor? What do you mean, who's your neighbor? Do you have a non-neighbor? It assumes that your mindset is, well, there's my folk, and then there's the rest of them. Couple facts, and I'm going to step out the way so Michael can sing. Jerusalem to Jericho is a 17-mile walk. It'd be comparable to a 17-mile walk through Bankhead at 10 p.m. It'd be comparable to a 17-mile walk through inner city Chicago at 10 p.m. They called it the Way of Blood. It was literally the name of the road. Josephus writes that people brought weapons to travel that road. Men fell victim to a social problem at the time: crime. And by chance, priest passes, thought there was hope, no hope in the priest. Priest goes all the way to the other side of the road. Why did he pass them? There's plenty of speculations, but we know he'd already worshiped. He wasn't worried about not being clean. Levite does the same thing. But if we judge them, we're judging ourselves. Because what will we do? Be civil? Right? Getting involved is costly, and the investment's too high. But to refuse is a moral failure. And so this Samaritan is named by ethnicity, for all the people who don't see color or ethnicity. God does. He's named by ethnicity. And Jesus is bringing it up like surely the half-breed won't do it, right? He represents the unqualified, the not good enough, while the priest and the Levite represent those who uphold the law, the self-righteous. The gang member, the gay couple, the atheist, the Muslim are the Samaritan. Moved by compassion, not theology, not ritual, not social anthropological commentary, moved by compassion. Civility for us is where compassion meets our hands and our feet. And my hope for us all is that we wouldn't be swayed by cultural assumptions, by the latest Twitter jargon, but by a higher standard, a higher moral standard, God's standard. So, thank you.
Well, there's a lot to chew on. Thank you, Lecrae. Well, you know you've been a blessing in my life. I think you've been a blessing to many others, blessing in this city, and we're just grateful for you. One of my greatest hopes in doing this event that by participating with me, you get to see what a packed house looks like. And I'm just glad I could let you in on my life. Lecrae kind of alluded to it, but Cherie left out of my bio, I am a recorded artist. My wife, the love of my life, betrays me often by recording me unknowingly in the car while I'm singing and posting it to Instagram. And those go viral, but not for good reason. These are truly times of great division in this country. Allow me to catalog some of the more outrageous events of this modern political era. We, of course, remember the claims during our most recent presidential campaign where Hillary Clinton's supporters were called godless and characterized as, quote, those who walk in rags and sleep amid filth and vermin. Vicious personal epithets are even today leveled against President Trump, as one prominent New York lawyer called him a, quote, barbarian, a yahoo, and a gorilla. In one New York newspaper, a preacher of all people referred to Trump as an unshapely man. What does this have to do with the substance of our politics? It's not just words, of course. We know incivility reigns when just last year we saw two senators get into a knife fight on the Senate floor. And I know we were all shocked when Vice President Mike Pence shot and killed former Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner in a duel. Okay, you caught me. I have not been entirely truthful. It was not supporters of Hillary Clinton who were called to walk in rags and sleep amid filth and vermin, but the supporters of George Washington. New York lawyers have called President Trump many things, but it was actually George Templeton Strong who called President Lincoln, not Trump, a barbarian and a yahoo. And Henry Ward Beecher called Lincoln unshapely. It wasn't a knife fight, but a caning that took place on the floor of the U.S. Senate when Representative Preston Brooks attacked Senator Charles Sumner in retaliation for Sumner's criticism of slaveholders, including a relative of Brooks. Get this, the official website of the U.S. Senate describes this event, this caning, as, quote, symbolic of the breakdown of reasoned discourse. I'll say, I think a caning qualifies as a breakdown of reasoned discourse. Finally, it is common knowledge that it was not Mike Pence killing Tim Geithner in a duel, but Aaron Burr, who infamously shot Lin-Manuel Miranda. Hamilton reference, really, yeah. Okay. Here's the point. Incivility in politics is not new. American politics has always been intertwined with and informed by personal animosities and egos. Yet we can be careful not to romanticize the past while also not downplaying the danger in our present. Something has changed. Social science makes it clear, but even if it didn't, we feel it in our own lives. In the next 12 minutes or so, I want to offer some thoughts on the value of civility and the misuse of it, the character of our incivility and what so often justifies it, and how we might root a resurgence of civility today. Civility is what philosopher and former president of Fuller Seminary Richard Mouw called public politeness. It amounts to a set of norms that make up a code of public decency. In politics, civility shows itself in respect for disagreement and the right to express it. Civility shows itself when we acknowledge the best in our political opponent's line of thinking, the best in our political opponents themselves. It is mercy and forgiveness. I have come to think of civility most succinctly as a public grace. Public grace. Civility is the kind of thing we tend to discuss when it is violated, but I believe it is just as recognizable when it is evident. That is to say, civility is the kind of thing that we appreciate when it is present to a similar degree that we miss it when it's absent. This is because civility reflects a recognition of human dignity. Incivility is toxic because it stems from a lapse in the recognition of human dignity, a recognition of the dignity of others, or a recognition of one's own dignity. When our political discourse lacks civility, it inflicts a distinct harm on citizens, as Lecrae so powerfully discussed. I believe at its root, all breaks with civility are preempted by dehumanization. If civility flows from a recognition of human dignity, incivility flows from a refusal or inability to recognize the dignity of the person. Incivility is driven by forces like partisan animosity. It's promoted by a political discourse that is increasingly reliant on symbols and pop culture rather than the concrete and more limited, tailored terrain for which politics is meant. There has always been a role for entertainment in politics and political discourse, but never before has politics been able to saturate our culture and our lives as it can today. In the face of these challenges, what resources can we draw on to fuel civility? The first perspective we can bring to our political discourse is that we enter the public in order to help people. It is really striking to me how quickly, how easily, how subtly we can slip into treating that which concerns the public into that which only concerns us as individuals. This is where incivility gains leverage, because we forget that politics is a shared project, and instead treat politics as a personal enterprise, disagreement as a personal affront. Citizenship calls us to engage differently. Political engagement motivated by service is much more likely to support civility. And when we enter into the public square, our goal is not to win, but to come alongside our fellow Americans, those in our community, in pursuit of the truth and in pursuit of a shared way forward. But even here, there are pitfalls. So that even as we enter into the public square to serve, we must have our service tempered by a humility about our capacity to serve well, to know what is right, to know what is truly, actually helpful. A spirit of humility allows us to act without the presumption that we have all the answers, as well as without the burden of needing all the answers before we act. Incivility often stems from a loss of patience with our neighbors, an indignation that they do not yet and may never see the world as we do. Yet patience is often in shorter supply for the zealous convert to a cause than the long-suffering laborer. I've noticed in my time in politics, contrary to what one might assume, it is not the person who is most vulnerable who is the most vitriolic, not the person who has come up against resistance and persevered for what they believe to be right who is most bitter, but the person for whom these issues are primarily emotional, the person who is trying to prove his commitment rather than just be committed. The person who has advocated for an issue for a long time is able to track the progress that has been made. They're aware of the various points of disagreement and understand the terrain. The recent convert is often battling self-hatred that it took him so long to, quote, see the light, and can take that out on those who have yet to see it for themselves. I've arrived, when will you, they seem to say. Humility suggests to us that none of us have arrived. That even positions that have been well considered and hard-earned might be wrong, might have unintended consequences, might not achieve that which we desperately want to achieve, or we might come to learn that our aims were not even set on the right target. Humility will give us the ability to separate a person's thinking from a person's dignity and help us to recognize and respect the latter, even when we vehemently disagree with the former. So a spirit of service, humility, and finally, I want to point to hope and a belief in something that is ultimate beyond ourselves. Hope has been derided as too esoteric, too ethereal for our very practical challenges, but this amounts to a fundamental misunderstanding of hope. I'll not recount the case for hope that I make in my book, but allow me to point to just one example of how hope is a resource for practical life, including civility. There's a document I found a couple years ago signed by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. It was prepared for those who would be participating in the integration of buses in Montgomery, Alabama. And in anticipation of a Supreme Court mandate ordering the integration of buses, King, who was then president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, suggested that this would, quote, place upon us all a tremendous responsibility of maintaining, in face of what could be some unpleasantness, a calm and loving dignity befitting good citizens. The document goes on to make general recommendations like, not all white people are opposed to integrated buses except goodwill on the part of many. Or another, in all things observe ordinary rules of courtesy and good behavior. And then listen to this. Be quiet but friendly, proud but not arrogant, joyful but not boisterous. Finally, he advised, be loving enough to absorb evil and understanding enough to turn an enemy into a friend. Now, there's a lot there, and we could spend an entire lecture just talking about this document and the sources that influenced it. But the main point I want to make here is that this kind of approach, this civil approach, is impossible without a commitment to deeper things than self-interest and the besting of one's opponents. At the same time, civility is not passivity towards the concrete, toward directional outcomes. King's faith and confidence in Jesus first, and in justice that is the will and providence of God second, allowed him to ground his activism, his political engagement, in certain moral commitments. In the face of great injustice, civility seems impractical, even offensive. Yet we should be careful before we discard it. We might find that what we could accomplish with incivility is much better accomplished with it, and that once civility is discarded, it is very difficult to reinstitute it. I think we're learning this now. There are those who say civility is the luxury of the privileged, that it is only those who have everything they need from our politics who can afford to act civilly in it. But look around you. Look at the headlines. When you think of who is most uncivil in our politics, is it those with the least power, those who are most vulnerable? Of course not. Civility does not just reflect a recognition of dignity, it is dignifying. The powerful thrive off of incivility. There is a kind of soft bigotry that suggests the poor, the vulnerable, the disadvantaged cannot act with civility, that civility is beyond them. But no, civility is not beyond the disadvantaged. They know civility better than most because they face incivility every day. They face incivility when politicians appeal to their base by suggesting illegal immigrants from Mexico are more likely to be rapists. They face incivility when politicians justify cuts to the safety net by scapegoating moochers and welfare queens. They face incivility when politicians belittle their religious beliefs as from the past and not welcome in modern life. The disadvantaged know civility well enough. It's the powerful who too often fail to recognize the dignity of the person. So let us not throw out civility because some have misused it or because we judge it to be impractical. Sure, civility has been misused by those in power. Unjust people will use anything at their disposal to stave off justice. But civility, in the end, levels the playing field. It provides the form and practice of political participation. It provides access to influence that would otherwise be unavailable. So allow me to conclude with a caution. I believe civility is critical, and I am deeply concerned about the coarsening of our political and public discourse. I imagine many of you are here because you share this concern. But I want to warn you, I want to warn us, that talk of civility is often used as a misdirection. Incivility is not an excuse to deflect on issues of public import. And when civility is used as a way to silence ideological opponents, it does nothing but promote cynicism and ultimately undermine civility itself. We should reflect ourselves on whether we employ calls for civility in circumstances that might hinder our political ambitions, or whether we only call for it from those with whom we disagree. In many ways, it reminds me of another topic I've been discussing a lot in my travels lately, and that is my conviction that Americans are increasingly going to politics in order to get their emotional and spiritual needs met. Now, I believe this is true. And I say it because I want to encourage people to think about whether that is true in their lives. But I do not recommend going up to an individual person and telling them, I think you're using politics to fill a spiritual void in your life. Right? Similar to that situation, I think civility is the kind of thing that best operates at the cultural level and then as a mode of self-critique, first of oneself and then of one's political allies. The last thing I want you to leave this talk with is the impression that what is needed is for the other side to act more civilly. If you want to see more civility, it is incumbent on you to be even more emphatic about your support for sound democratic processes and a fair and impartial government. Injustice does not justify incivility, but it is reasonable for incivility to spring forth from injustice. A great threat to civility is people who are proponents of it, but quietists on everything else. They are silent on voter disenfranchisement, but quick to urge the disenfranchised to be civil in how they express their disagreement. They are silent on the inequities and injustices in our criminal justice system, but more than happy to retweet videos of protesters blocking off highways or cussing at pedestrians. We can hardly encourage civility if we undermine a healthy civic life. That just doesn't make any sense. So civility requires courage, it requires humility, it requires a spirit of service, it requires hope and a bigger perspective. The presence of civility is a reminder to our fellow citizens that we are invested in this project of self-governance together, that their dignity warrants some basic level of decency as we enter into the public square for our shared benefit, even if we disagree on what that entails. Civility does not answer all of our problems. It is no panacea. Civility will not erase injustice, but it helps provide a framework for doing so. It helps provide a vision for politics that is about more than the acquisition of power and the reckless use of that power. And I think we could use some more of that. Thank you.
There were so many mic drop moments there, I don't even know where to start. But one of the things I think that has undoubtedly occurred to many members of the audience is that both of you actually have a background in two of the industries that are seen as the most uncivil, rap music and politics. And moreover, both of them are industries where incivility seems to be positively reinforced and rewarded. Certainly in politics, it seems like it is in one's best interest to be as nasty as one wants to be. In rap, I actually think there's a song by that title. And certainly gangster rap, there's been a lot of monetary incentive to push the envelope. So as people who have sought to navigate those fields, what advice would you give for others to whom in similar industries it may well feel like exercising civility is a form of unilateral disarmament?
Well, I think that's exactly right. And there's someone in the room, Mark DeMoss, who's done a great deal of work on civility and been a great steward and ambassador for civility. And I think, and I don't want to speak for him, but in my experience working on civility issues, you ask one side to be civil, and they say, "Oh, I'd love to be civil," as soon as the other side does it. Yeah, I'm waiting on them. And so we really just have this standoff. I think I'd argue on two levels. To the general practitioner, I think incivility always in the long run bounces back to hurt your cause. People, I think there's a way to look at 2016 as an expression of that, and I think what we see down the road will continue that trend. And the reason for that is that incivility is soul crushing. It's very, people understand when they're not being talked to or treated with dignity. And there's going to be a reaction against that. And so that would be for practitioners, just as a matter of general health and I think just practical success. Incivility is going to bounce back and hurt you. The second thing I'd say is that for Christians, there will be short-term losses. I knew in my time in politics, and I'm still in politics now, but in campaigns, there were tools in the toolbox that I, as a Christian, knew were available, but that I had forsaken, that I just said I would not use these tools. And for Christians, that is the moral responsibility we have that will have some real costs. Like we'll have to actually say we're going to be less successful in our field at certain points in order to uphold a standard that God has called us to. I don't want to have like a utilitarian, in the end it'll all work out. Like sometimes it doesn't. But I will say, when you treat people as who they are, as image bearers of God, God's economy finds a way to bless people with that, even if you have to take some temporal costs, and maybe you don't get that job offer, or maybe you don't win that campaign, or maybe your album doesn't sell as much as it could have if you had put a couple more diss tracks on it and that kind of thing.
Lecrae, anything to add?
Yeah, I agree to his endpoint of sometimes you just have to be okay with your ceiling being someone else's floor, and that's what you're here to do. You may not win in the way that the world thinks you should win, and as he alluded to or he spoke about earlier, like disenfranchised people groups, typically show off incivility for the enjoyment of those in power. And so when you think about hip-hop music, it started off as a music that was for the community to warn each other. Like, there were songs like, don't do this, don't do that. Broken glass everywhere. If you really, it's like, be careful. And once an outside consumer said, I like this, tell us more of these war stories, and it began to turn into, you like that? I got some more. I got some. You want to see me shoot somebody? I'll do that if you pay me for it. You can look at boxing. Boxing is always the disenfranchised people groups. It's the Italian immigrants, then it was the Irish immigrants, and then it's the black and the Hispanics, and people enjoy watching, others beat each other down when you're in power. So, yeah.
Those of us who share a Christian faith would seem to have a basis to bridge difference. But it hasn't really worked out that way, at least not seemingly so. Why do you believe that the faith community is as fractured and divided as the general public?
How much time we have?
I think, so I do believe there are tribes within the faith community. There's kind of, this mainline view. There's the larger evangelical group, and I think under the umbrellas of Catholicism, so on and so forth, under these umbrellas, there's a way, there's a conduct, there's a code of how things should be done, and as long as you kind of walk in that, you don't rock that boat too much, you're fine. But as soon as you deter from some of these particulars that everyone thinks, no, this is the way it should be, I think that's where the tension begins to rise. And, as it pertains to just, I don't know, win them, send them, and build them. If we're doing that, we're good. That's when it seems like, everything's flowing fine. But then smaller issues come into play. A political season happens, and I thought we were all win, sit, and build. No. You don't agree with my politics, so you're not the same kind of Christian as I am. I think every ethnic minority is probably, not every, but I can't speak for everyone, but I think there's a lot of ethnic minorities who struggle with, I may be theologically conservative, but I'm very culturally and sociologically liberal, because I have to be. I kind of navigate different spaces. And so my politics may look different. My interaction with culture may look different. My thoughts on money and power and so on and so forth may look different. And I think that's where, outside of the typical doctrinal clashes, these cultural clashes begin to cause more divisiveness.
That's well said. I usually don't say this bluntly, but there's a lack of confidence in Jesus Christ. We have we're happy to maybe invite Jesus into our wishes and our hopes. Happy to ask Jesus to open up that parking spot, or even hope hope I get married. Hope God blesses my family. But when it comes to public challenges, somehow we think Jesus is daunted by those, and that we need to kind of help him out. That he just doesn't understand. We treat the 23rd Psalm as something to just put up in a plaque in our living room and not a lived reality. David was not on his front porch swinging in a chair when he wrote. He was being surrounded by his enemies, and yet God set a table for him in the midst of his enemies and walked with him through the valley of the shadow of death. I mean, that's not just a nursery rhyme. That's what God can do if we'll trust him in all things. And so I think we have a lack of formation for public things. I think we evangelicalism came to understand several decades ago that sort of the evangelical teaching presumption has been that if we teach general principles, if we teach spirits of the fruit, that people in the pews will be able to connect those things to their individual lives. We came to the understanding that in the area of vocation, that wasn't happening. Even though we were teaching all the basics, all the core tenets of the faith, people going into their day jobs would say, I don't see how God has anything to do with my work. And so what we did was we built up institutions. We built up centers, institutes for faith and work. They're now all over the country. Pastors started teaching specific sermons on what God wants to do in your vocation, and we need a similar movement now for public things.
Let me ask you both to reflect a little bit on the way our tools shape our discourse. I mean, one of the things the church does not do much of is to reflect upon the way technology shapes us. But there has certainly been plenty of work done in this area. I think it was Marshall McLuhan who said the medium is the message, the media is the message. And how we get our information shapes the content of that information, just in the same way that it's very difficult to do philosophy by smoke signal. As we're moving more and more into a social media world, which seems to encourage and positively reinforce the snappy bit of snark, the quick put down, the devastating burn, is it possible to have civility with trafficking in social media?
As Michael said earlier, I mean, it starts with you. You know, you have to begin civil acts yourself. And, as my wife would encourage me constantly is, TYOT, turn off your tech. You know what I mean? Because you're about to say something you don't need to say, or respond in a way that you don't need to respond. And I think we do reward, there's instant gratification. We're a society of people who have a lack of identity, and we can find our identity in people affirming us on social media. A like button or a retweet in some weird way says I matter, and we're all guilty of it. But it's just kind of like, oh, look how many retweets I got, as if it has some bearing on our soul and our identity. So to that degree, I do think there's danger in that kind of quick response reality of just, oh, let me comment, let me say something back. There's not a lot of time and thought in that ecosystem. It's not built for that, right? And we try to force everything into this ecosystem, and 140, 280 characters are not meant for a dissertation on civility. Yeah. So I do agree that it's a dangerous medium, and we're navigating it, and I think we have yet to see what that'll look like. I mean, it's as with everything in our world and in our countries, like we don't find out how dangerous some things are until way down the line, you know? And so it's kind of like, oh, you've been eating that all this time? You didn't know that it had that in there? Sorry, it's too late now. So who knows what'll happen in 25 years? We'll all be sitting around like, man, you were on Twitter all the time? Yeah, sorry about that, man.
Yeah, you know, I'll just say I've been thinking a lot about sort of what are 21st century spiritual disciplines that can push back against the sort of unique temptations of things like social media. And so, you know, I think the old spiritual disciplines of solitude and silence have a lot to offer in this time when you just have a platform just all the time accessible to you. But I've also been thinking a lot about the spiritual discipline of public apology and making sure that if you make a mistake in public, that you apologize for it publicly. And so I'm not perfect in this regard, but I think it's useful. Like, don't delete that tweet. Now, of course, there are certain circumstances, but like if you can bless other people by saying, do you know what, I was just flipping through my timeline and I was being reactive and I tweeted something because my blood pressure was up because I was just reading through this stuff and I posted something that I shouldn't have. I just want to apologize. I think that will build up a reflex in you that's a painful thing to have to do, and you do that enough times and you'll be a little less quick on the trigger. But second, it sets a powerful example for others. So yeah, finding ways that we could actually build up the sort of character in order to push back against some of these worst impulses that we all, fall prey to.
Last month, we commemorated the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And in many ways, I think one of the most remarkable and brilliant examples of civility and persuasion is Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, which he wrote, as you know, on the scraps of paper and toilet paper. But in it, to make his argument to the white, moderate clergymen, he made appeals to Augustine, Aquinas, Reinhold Niebuhr, John Bunyan, essentially used arguments and figures that would have sway with the people that he was trying to argue with, or trying to persuade. But as we know, he was hated at the time, lionized now, but deeply unpopular at the time, fiercely opposed, and really the last 3 years of his life were among the most difficult. So before we turn to audience questions, I wanted to ask both of you what encouragement, advice, and cautions you would give to young people who are eager to confront injustice.
Keep a counselor on speed dial. No, I do think, I love the idealism of youthful idealism. I think youthful idealism matched with aged realism creates a healthy perspective. And so I think if you are rushing out to stand in the face of injustice, have older, wiser people who've experienced this, because these issues are not new issues. Injustice is not a new thing. It's as old as sin. And I think for me, I had, voices I could lean into and ask questions to who had been through some of the places I've been and could encourage me and tell me, there's an end to this, or you don't have to feel this way, or this is what typically happens when you engage from this particular direction. And I do think the youthful idealism tends to not contemplate that these are not new issues, right? And that these are not things that have never been addressed before. They have been addressed, and they've been addressed wrong, and they've been addressed right. And what can we learn from that? So, I think that would be one of the biggest pieces that's helped me. And then having a circle, I know for me specifically, having a circle of peers, of friends who I could, vent to, talk to, process through. People who were trying to face me, not fix me, right? So I could say off-the-wall things in this circle, and they weren't, it's like Job's friends. They weren't Job's friends. They were friends who were like, tell me more, man. That's good. Let it out. Let it out. And then they could stop me before I left and say, let's talk about some of these particular things that you mentioned. And having that circle of friends is very helpful and very healthy.
Yeah, I mean, I just echo what was said. The only thing I'd add, which is really just piggybacking on what Lecrae just said, is having a sense of history. So if you've been newly awakened to a cause or a set of issues, understanding that you didn't discover those issues, that there are people who have been laboring and a context that's there, and making sure, emotion can be useful. Emotion can be a great guide, but if you're allowing your emotion to yank you around in every direction without instead sort of letting it guide you and sort of send you in directions where you could use your intellect and your heart and your soul and be grounded, then that could be a dangerous thing. And so, that, in addition to Lecrae's excellent advice of having strong counsel around you and respecting elders, having elders in your life, which hopefully we're in communities, especially in churches that are multi-generational and that facilitate that. Hopefully we're in cities where you have people like Reverend Joseph Lowry that Atlanta has been blessed with for so long, people like Robert Franklin, who was here earlier, who are not new to this. So, yeah.
Well, there is so much more to ask, but we're going to turn to the conversation part of this evening conversation and hear from each of you, or perhaps not each of you, but many of you. And if you've been to a Trinity Forum event before, you know that we have just 3 guidelines for audience questions. We ask that all questions be brief, all questions, not surprisingly, be civil, and all questions should be in the form of a question. So please wait till you're called on and a mic comes to you, and questions from the audience. Right here, front row.
How do you both feel that the church not really teaching people, encouraging people to think generationally has impacted this issue?
Who wants to tackle that?
I'll be quick. And I just say, I think it promotes a sense of anxiety and a sense of, I think, unhealthy burden. And it's also, we aren't, it leads to the younger generation making the same mistakes that they could have learned if they had just had the humility to sit at the feet of people who have already been through this. And then I'd also say, it cultivates, I've said before in relation to just politics generally that sort of oftentimes idealism is just one stop on the way to cynicism, and there's rarely a midpoint on that. And so, but being able to sit in front of elders will create a midpoint and hopefully an endpoint on that, and that's hope. When you learn from people who have been through this, and have seen the other side, have actually wrestled with disappointment, but found hope on the other end of it. There's so much patronizing talk about our elders who have seen much more than we ever would, talking about hope as if hope was held them back. No, hope kept them afloat. And hope was real and is real. And this sort of patronizing sort of, if only maybe they had been more radical. No, there's nothing more radical than hope in the face of injustice.
Yeah, I would add, I think you usually see like two dichotomies. You see us as a church grasping toward relevance, or tradition. And those who are grasping at relevance scoff at the traditional, and those who are traditional scoff at those who are grasping for relevance. And as a music artist, we have this thing in hip hop called sampling. It's where the new studies the old to make something else. That it takes the best from this particular world and the best from this particular world and creates something that everyone can appreciate. And I think that's where we need to move forward as a church, is appreciating. We have the Bible is relevant, Jesus is relevant. That's all the relevance you need, but it's figuring out how to engage culture and learning from the traditions and the things that we've had in the past.
Other questions? Right there, Tim.
First of all, thank you both. This was excellent. Just continuing on with the idea of conversation, just wanted to hear particular resources that would be really good for us to continue this conversation on as we leave.
It's in terms of what I've wrestled with, where it is a little bit of a bleed of faith, race, politics. I love Emerson's Divided by Faith. It's a really good book that unpacks a lot of misconceptions and cultural ideals that we all kind of hold to, and how we miss each other on so many cultural planes as we all are pursuing our faith. So I love Divided by Faith. It's been a helpful book for me.
Besides reclaiming hope.
Yeah, right, yeah. Dallas Willard's The Allure of Gentleness is really helpful. My friend Tyler Wigg Stevenson wrote this book, The World Is Not Ours to Save. I think 2014, 2013, that's helpful. Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited is really, Thurman provided a lot of the theological underpinnings of King's work. And if you came with sort of modern eyes to that book, you'd be shocked by what Thurman writes, because he writes in a way that acknowledges in really stark terms. Here's what he does. He makes clear that the position of the disinherited is not that they lack dignity, but that they're in undignifying conditions that are actually, that's what makes injustice. And then I just point King's strength to love, and he gave a speech at I think Stanford in 1965, where he talked about riots and how riots are the language of the unheard, in a way that doesn't justify them, but kind of cuts through a lot of the rhetoric that was just about evading the issues of the day.
Other questions from the audience? Someone up in the balcony. You may just have to project rather than waiting for the microphone.
I can do that. The Old Testament prophets and the Apostle Paul and Jesus himself said many things that might be perceived as incivil.
Yeah.
How do you distinguish genuinely prophetic, gracious speech from incivil speech?
Yeah, I definitely, we were talking about that earlier today. Jesus coming and turning over tables in the temple probably wouldn't seem very civil to folks. But it wasn't out of a desire to demean or strip away the dignity. It was actually out of a desire to get them to see the dignity and the worth and the value in the people that they were manipulating and treating in civil. And so I think, as Michael was talking about emotions, I think emotions are good. Emotions have a level of fruitfulness and toxicity, and it's saying, okay, I'm angry. What is my anger driving? Is it going to drive me to passion and being constructive anger, or is it going to drive me to destructive anger and tyranny? And so it's navigating those emotions to where you're trying to build up, you're trying to create something, uplift and uphold versus, demean and tear down. Unless we're talking about the devil, tear him down. But.
Yeah, I just say, there's so much, especially in sort of political, religious advocacy. There's a lot of sort of claiming the mantle of being a prophet or pointing to Jesus overturning tables. And I just urge some humility of putting ourselves in that position. Like the prophets for profit, you just may be talking where you should be quiet. I think there's a we ought to be there may be times for turning over tables, but Jesus in all of his perfect wisdom overturned the tables at the right time for the right purpose with the right intent, and we ought to make sure that all of those things are in check for us before we do this and claim to be taking on the mantle of Jesus and Jeremiah and Paul.
That's good.
We'll take one more question right there. You could
First of all, this was wonderful to hear and fascinating, but my question is to Lecrae. I was very struck by your comment when you said in 2012, with Trayvon Martin being murdered, that you didn't see the reaction you had hoped for. But one of the things I would want you to know is that seeds of change were sown in the hearts of many children who witnessed it, regardless of their skin color. I've seen it within my own children. And so one of the things that I would want to know if you would be willing to do is to use the platform you have and the ability that you have through your music and the way you can connect with young people to get them out to vote. Because this next election will be so incredibly important for reclaiming civility and how we want our country to be. But it's going to, I think, hinge on our ability to engage this generation that has seen and witnessed all of this in a positive way and give them hope that they can make the difference.
That's good. Yeah, I want to always be the person who is constantly being informed and surrounding myself. I never feel the need to be what I'm not, right? I am not a politician. I am, I'm not an academic. Those are areas that I enjoy learning about and diving into, and I love having politicians and academics around me consistently for the sake of learning. And what I would challenge young people to do more than anything is to on one front, be politically responsible, right? So just to educate yourself on what politics means, what it looks like. I think, change happens through policy. Change happens through publicity and being public, and then change happens, through proactivity and being involved in making things happen. So to answer your question, I would say, the primary thing that I want somebody to do is to educate themselves on the issues at hand and and then move to be politically responsible and to vote and to uphold your mantle in that area, because I'd be nervous to say, go vote. And they're like, yeah, all right, cool. B. And so, you know, as I'm growing and learning, I'm very appreciative of people like Michael who are engaging the faith spheres with the issue of politics, because I think politics is an area that Christians usually steer clear from. We just say, Satan can have that. Instead of trying to learn how to engage it with a worldview, a Christian worldview, that can help shape, you know, the foundations of our country. And so, yeah.
Michael, anything to add?
No, I think that's
Great.
perfect.
Lecrae, Michael, thank you.
You didn't sing.
I got out of it. After party.
And Matt, come and close us out.
Good evening. I'm Matt Teague, and I have the pleasure of being on our steering committee here in Atlanta. And I just wanted to say a quick final thank you to Lecrae and Michael. Thank you so much for being here tonight and engaging in a very thought-provoking and sometimes difficult discussion. So one more round of applause for them. Good. And to all of you who joined us tonight, we wanted to make a little plug that, well, first of all, we hope you had a wonderful evening, but also both of their books are available at the front where you walked in, and I know that they would appreciate if you take a look at that. But also, one of the questions was about further resources, and one thing that we like to do with the Trinity Forum is to have reading conversations with reading groups throughout the year. And we would like to start the next one later this summer. So when we first started to launch this initiative last spring, we announced reading groups that would offer the opportunity to further dive into these issues that we talk about at our evening conversations, except within a smaller setting like in some of our homes. And so last year, we had a few groups that met to discuss MLK's letter from Birmingham jail. And then earlier this year, we had a few groups that met to discuss politics, morality, and civility, written by Václav Havel. And so in the next few months, as a follow-up to tonight, we'll be hosting reading groups around Atlanta to discuss excerpts from Nelson Mandela's autobiography called Long Road to Freedom, and reflect on how Mandela's modeling of both courage and forgiveness helped unify and heal his country. So if you're interested in participating in that, please sign up where you came in the front door tonight, and also you'll be receiving some emails in the coming weeks to sign up as well. So we hope you can join us there. In addition to the reading groups, we invite you to join the Trinity Forum Society. And one of the great benefits of that is the quarterly readings that the Trinity Forum group puts out, which are just very thoughtful, and they're relatively short, so if you have ADD like me, it's easy to sit down and read, and also they have some good questions in the back to go through as a group. So the Trinity Forum Society will provide those books quarterly, and also provide monthly podcasts in addition to frequent emails, just with a curated list of articles that are coming out that the Trinity Forum staff has picked out for the Society's enjoyment. So as we conclude, we wanted to also thank our volunteers here at the Carter Center, Laura Jordan, Eric Scott, Tracy Wilson, Tim Kerbuth, and also the Carter Center staff for helping us out here tonight. And finally, our photographer, Chris Berry, and videographer, Brandon Bishop. And also wanted to point out and to send a thank you to Cherie and her team for Colleen is right here, and Alyssa is right in the back. So if you could just give them a round of applause. They've really worked they've really worked tirelessly for this event tonight, so we greatly appreciate that. So finally, thank you to each of you for your presence tonight, and good night.